we are about to have another panel. Brit Kirwan is a legendary figure in Maryland and among university presidents nationwide. You can read about him in the bios. The bios only begin to describe what he has accomplished. What's important here is that this report took the shape that it did and earned the support that it has gotten because of his commitment, his leadership, and his personal integrity. Rachel Hise is the lead Principal Analyst and Education Work Group leader for the Maryland Department of Legislative Services. That is a very big mouthful, Rachel. What's important to know about Rachel is that she is held in very high esteem by the members of the General Assembly on both sides of the aisle for her deep knowledge of the education arena, her integrity, and her ability. She has served, as I said earlier, Brit Kirwan as both his right and his left hand as the commission work has gone forward. No matter how hard the sledding got, Rachel never gave up. It's in her constitution. And so, Rachel, this whole thing started when you attended a meeting of the NCSL several years ago. Would you tell us a little bit about that and how it led to the charge to the Commission to the proposed policies that would enable Maryland to match the achievements of the top performing countries?
Thank you, Mark. So in 2013, NCSL had one of their conferences, and I'm probably not going to pronounce his name right, but Andreas Schleicher from OECD presented the PISA results, the most recent PISA results. And it was a room probably bigger than, there were more people than this in the room. And you could hear a pin drop. It just was completely silent as everyone took in what he was telling us, which is that the United States was generously in the middle of the pack in the world in education and moving in the wrong direction. And it struck everyone in the room that we had to do something about that. And NCSL ended up creating an international study group with legislators and some legislative staff on it to look into what the top performing systems were doing and differently than what we were doing in the United States. And I had the privilege of serving on that, along with a legislator from Maryland was also on it, Rich Madaleno. And it was very fortuitous because Maryland was about to embark on an adequacy study. It had been over 10 years since we had done the last adequacy study, which was done under the auspices of what's called the Thornton Commission, named after the chairman of that group, Dr. Thornton. And that adequacy study was really just about how much do we need to spend to achieve the performance results we were after. But it really wasn't about what to do with that money. And so as we started to think about how we were going to approach the adequacy study, it kind of clicked in my head, not just my head, that we needed to actually not just talk about how much we need to spend, but how to spend it to get the results that we clearly are not getting. We're not getting, the country is not getting, Maryland is not getting. And so it just was really the perfect timing. And the legislature then wanted to create a successor commission to the Thornton Commission to do the work. And as part of the charge of that commission, looking at the top performing systems became a key element of that.
And so one day that led to Brit getting a call.
Right.
So Brit, what did the call say? Why did you say yes? What were you worried about? And what happened next?
Yes. Well, I was on summer vacation, actually, when the call came, asking if I would be willing to chair this commission to make recommendations so that Maryland schools would perform at the level of the best performing systems in the world. And So it was, I think, a combination of exhilaration and naivete on my part. The exhilaration of, being a part of something that would propel Maryland schools to the top. I mean, how could you say no to that effort? Having hung up the phone and thinking about it for a few moments, I thought to myself, oh my God, how are we going to go about developing recommendations that will reach this level? And I was blessed to learn that this person on my left was going to be the chief of staff. And what an incredible source of support and wisdom for the commission, Rachel, along with her staff. But she brought to my attention NCEE. And it was a wonderful moment that the gods were looking after me. There was a resource that had done research on what makes top performing systems, that there were a set of building blocks. And this gave us the means, the mechanism to be able to develop in a very rigorous, thoughtful way a set of these 5 policy recommendations.
So, Brit, you were given not just a task, but you were also given a commission.
Right.
So who was on it?
Yes.
And when you looked at who was on it, when you looked at what was on it, what did you think of with respect to what the challenge was going to be, and what strategy did you develop for coping with it?
Well, the interesting thing about the commission, first of all, it was except 24 and exceptional people joined me on the commission, some of whom I knew, many of whom I did not know. What was interesting, and it turns out was very thoughtful by the governor and the General Assembly in putting together the commission, is that it was so broadly representative of all the entities that are or most of the entities engaged in education. So the superintendents were represented, the county school boards were represented, the collective bargaining units, the business community, the General Assembly. I mean, it was really a smorgasbord of those who are, professionally involved. The PTA was also representative. And in a certain sense, that created a challenge because all 25 came to the meeting knowing exactly what needed to be done to fix education. The problem was there were 25 different opinions. And so we had to work together to mold that into this consensus report. But in hindsight, it is the only way we could have gotten to where we got. I mean, in other words, if we didn't have all the voices, or most of the voices, at the table helping to shape the recommendations, we couldn't have developed a report that has been so widely embraced across the state. One thing that was, given all the diversity of representation on the commission, there were 2 incredibly proud moments, meaningful, emotional moments for me in all this work, and that was when we took the final vote on within the commission on the interim report, and there was not one single dissenting vote. That was just an extraordinary moment.
So let me ask you about that. When it all began, there were a number of observers, some of them members of the commission, who were quite certain that it was going to be absolutely impossible to get a group composed as you have described to sit down and write a plan which would essentially redesign the whole system. And in the end, you got the result that you just reported. How did that happen?
Well, I have to say that all those years dealing with faculty senates was enormously helpful, because I was used to addressing bodies that had strong and differing views on subjects. But, I think the only way something of this depth and complexity can lead to a consensus is by taking the time to hear from everyone, and letting people talk, and you know, not short circuit or cut off debate on topics. So we took time, a lot of time, and some people say too much time, but I would argue that it is the only way we could have reached the level of consensus that we reached on this report. And let me, if I may, mention the other moment of great exhilaration. Of course, the report goes to the General Assembly, and you know, Rachel plays a unique role. She was helping the commission write its report, and then she drafts the bill for with the support of the members of the General Assembly who were on the commission, that became the blueprint for Maryland. So the bill embraced the policy recommendations that this is going to be the foundation for K through 12 education in Maryland going forward. It provided funding for to jumpstart the recommendations. It provided in fiscal 20, fiscal 21, the state share of the cost of implementation, of investment in fiscal 22. So this is a magnificent bill, fully captured in capturing what the commission had recommended. And so it goes to the General Assembly now for action. And it went, I was sitting in the gallery in the Senate, and there was this intense, you know, the bill comes up and there was this debate, and at a certain point, the chair of the Republican caucus stands up and says, you know, I just met with, earlier today, we met with Dr. Kirwan and Rachel Hise, and we went over this report. And I believe that this is a different animal than we're used to. This is a report that calls for a different way of doing K through 12 education, and I, for one, am going to support this bill. And the bill passed in the General Assembly unanimously.
That's a remarkable accomplishment. So, Brit, you've spent a lifetime in higher education. That's been the pool you have been swimming in. And yet you told me and others not all that long ago that this is the most important thing you've ever done. Why?
Well, you know, it really, I think it's buried in the information you shared with us at the start of this. I mean, we have a significant problem in our country. There is a complacency and a false assumption that we are doing okay in education, and we're not. And it is the case. You know, look, I'm an octogenarian, so, but when I think about my children, my grandchildren, their children, what kind of world are they going to grow up in? What kind of country are they going to have if we don't address this education problem? When I go around, which I do seemingly endlessly, and talk to groups about what's in the commission report, there is one piece of data that I give them that is gets everybody's attention. Maryland has a very modest college and career ready standard. It's in some sense embarrassing. It is that you can read at the 10th grade level and you can pass an Algebra 1 exam. That for Maryland is college and career ready. That's why we have so much remedial education in higher education. But here is the punchline. This June, fewer than 40% of our high school graduates will meet that standard. Now, what does that mean about the future for our state? And we're not alone. What does that mean about the future of our country? That's why addressing this issue is so critically important.
Let me just underline that with a big, great underline. Maryland sits right square in the middle of the national distribution of scores on NAEP. If you are looking for a state which is an emblem for the United States as a whole, you could not find a better state than Maryland. What Brit just described is where the country is. Not every state, but on average, that is precisely where the country is. So let me ask you a related question to this. When the commission had its first meeting, I believe it's true, you can tell me I'm wrong, that most of the commissioners believed, because of a report that had been published earlier, a few years earlier by Education Week, that Maryland had one of the best education systems in the country. What happened when they found out that wasn't true?
Well, I think Rachel and you probably will agree. Most of the commissioners, when they came into the room, thought, okay, this is not a, we're doing pretty well in Maryland. We got a really good education system. We've gotten all these reports and rankings and so on and so forth. But when Rachel and her staff produced the data in NCEE on the outcomes, what are students actually learning? And we found out that we were very much in the middle of a pack in a country that is very much in the middle of the pack in the industrialized world. That was a shock. There was one other shock, and once again, thanks to the work of Rachel and DLS, we learned that we have significant funding inequities in the state. Most of us came thinking Maryland's a very progressive state, so we've addressed funding equity issues. Wrong. There was one report that came to our attention that showed Maryland was the 15th most regressive state in the U.S. So those two facts, I think, really galvanized the commission and got people to understand there was something much bigger. We had to come together because there were problems that had to be fixed for the future of our children and our state.
You had to sum up what's been, let me be clear before I ask this question. The work of the commission is not done.
Oh, no.
The work of the commission is not done. That is why the report that you all have in your hand is called an interim report. That said, what do you think has been accomplished?
Well, I think we have produced a report because of the rigor, because of the research of NCEE in developing the building blocks, the rigor of our analysis. Basically, our report is filling through a gap analysis between what we do, adapting the best performing practices to the context of Maryland. So we have produced a report that I have very high confidence would take Maryland to the top, among the best, and close achievement gaps. I am as confident of that as I can be about everything. We also come out of the General Assembly session with a lot, enormous momentum. We had a very bipartisan support in the General Assembly for the adoption of the bill, the passage of the bill. But we've got some difficult days ahead of us because one of the things we have to do now, again with Rachel's and DLS's help, is decide how we divide up the cost of the report between the locals and the state. We've got an overall number, but that's got to be divided between the state and the locals. We got to build a formula that will support that. And it's going to require new revenue. And in this day and age, it is not easy to talk about new revenue. There's a mantra out there, sadly, that we don't raise revenue to invest in our future, as we did in decades past. So, getting the formula right and developing the momentum, the grassroots and grass top support to say, yes, this is too important. We have to raise revenue to make this happen, or at least find sources of revenue to make this happen.
So there was, if I can borrow a word from the title of this meeting, there was no blueprint for how a commission like this produces a report like this. And the plan for doing it was in constant development from beginning to end. Looking back on it, let me ask first you, Rachel, and then you, Brit. We only have a minute or two left. What is your advice to other states on how you do this kind of work.
Well, just to underscore something that Brit said, it takes a lot of time, much more time than most I mean, those of you who work in states, you know, there are lots of commissions and they have a 1-year charge, maybe a 2-year charge. You know, we're going on calendar-wise year 4. So it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of staff time. We could never have done it without NCEE, but in the Department of Legislative Services, myself and a number of other people, we actually were looking at the time we spent, and collectively from, let's say, April to December of 2018, we spent 1,000 staff hours on the commission. So you really need to commit the time and the resources to do it. And Brit also says that this is one of the hardest things he's ever done. And that's saying something. It's one of the hardest things I've done too, but that's not saying quite as much as Brit. But this is really hard. And you need to go into it appreciating that and just get to it.
Yeah, I would say one thing that really created a new dynamic within the commission. In the beginning, the commission was basically sitting around an enormous table, listening to people talk, and then having some debate in a plenary format. And you just didn't have the feeling that the commission members were yet taking ownership of this effort. And Rachel had the brilliant idea that we needed to break into work groups. And around there are 5 policy areas. We took the first 4, the accountability we left for the entire group, but we divided the commission up into 4 work groups around each policy area and told them to come back with the detailed recommendations in those groups. And this started an intense period of activity of work, and you could just see the members of the commission beginning to feel, you know, this is our report, and I think that was a critical moment, and it's something that I think made the effort a success. It really brought the commission together in a very energized way.
Rachel, Brit, thank you. We're going to have you back, Brit.